Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drum McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at thechangeleader.com. Changing Higher Ed is sponsored by Blackbaud, the world's leading cloud software company powering social good. With their cloud solution for higher education, Blackbaud connects thousands of campuses worldwide. Visit blackbaud.com/highered to learn how they can help your institution deliver a better experience. And now, here's your host, Drum McNaughton.
Thank you, David. We've got a special edition of Changing Higher Ed today, one that just happened on us and is so relevant given what universities are going through with the current COVID crisis. A frontline provost who just moved all her institution's education offerings online. Dr. Risa Dickson currently serves as interim vice president for academic affairs at Palo Alto University. She's no stranger to leadership positions in higher ed, including having served as chief academic officer for the University of Hawaii system and provost at CSU San Bernardino. She's also an ACE fellow at Pitzer College, where she assisted with WASC reaccreditation and institutional strategic planning. What's unique about Risa is she's a superb crisis management leader, something that's outside the norm for higher ed. And she joined us to talk about how the different leadership styles, both crisis management and relationship management styles, are so critical in today's times. Risa, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Drum. I'm very excited to be here.
Oh, good to have you here too. It's been a while since we've been able to catch up. Of course, you've been up to your eyeballs with stuff up at Palo Alto, moving classes online, etc. Tell me, what have you guys had to do over the last 3 weeks? It's got to have been a whirlwind.
It's been a little crazy. And so we were real fortunate, I think, in that we had a couple of things happen early on. One is we anticipated fairly quickly that we were likely going to have to move things online. For instance, we're in Santa Clara County, which initially was one of the first places that the virus had started to grow. And we have a number of a number of classes online. So we had the Zoom technology. We decided back in the first week of March that we were likely going to have to take the classes online, at least for a while, because of what was happening in Santa Clara County. So it was March 7th that the president called an emergency cabinet meeting. It was a Saturday. We all got together and decided to put the classes online for 3 weeks. And that's where essentially this all started, and it just ended up in weeks of just crazy, almost whipsaw changes as the decisions from the government or decisions nationally started coming that were changing what we were doing. So that's essentially what we've been doing from an academic perspective. It's been anticipating what we need to do. Initially, what I did, which I think really helped us, was the week before we decided to go online, about Tuesday maybe, of the week that led up to that Saturday, I contacted our academic technology person and asked them to put together a protocol of what it would take to go online, along with a budget. So when we entered this, we actually had a plan and a budget that indicated the number of resources we were going to need to get our faculty and our students online for the remainder of the quarter. So we're on quarters. So that's essentially where we started with this. And then it's just been a wild ride since then.
Oh, I can just only imagine. A lot of my clients are converting online, but many of them didn't have the infrastructure, so they're having to build it from scratch. Now, the leadership styles that are necessary to get these kind of things done are very different from, keeping the lights on day-to-day type of thing. You've got crisis leadership, transformational, and then your usual relationship type leadership. Every cabinet has different people with different leadership styles. How's it been working for you guys?
Well, it's been fascinating because, as you know, when you have a crisis, you really have to muster your resources very quickly. And one of the things, we had already been through 2 previous crises as a cabinet, but I think we were not prepared for how different this crisis was. Because when you're talking about leadership styles, you're talking about it in terms of the context of the crisis. But this crisis isn't just an organizational crisis. This is a universal crisis. This is affecting our personal lives. This is affecting, how we're living our day to day. And so one of the things we've noted, that I've specifically noted, is that there's a lot of bleeding over and a lot more anxiety in this situation. And I think a lot more personalization. But it also became really apparent that people in the institution were dealing with the anxiety and the panic and the fear very, very differently, and the idea of how to move things forward. And I noticed that those of us who are very command and control or crisis leadership kind of people naturally emerged in terms of wanting to know, how do we move forward? What are our plans? Who takes on what role? Where is the command central? Who's calling the shots? But at the same time, just as strongly, there was another element that was saying we need to minister to people. People are scared. We need to make sure everybody's on the same page. We need to make sure that, they have faith in us, that we understand not just what to do, but that what their situations are, or that we've got them covered psychologically and emotionally too, which I think is an element that isn't always as pronounced in a crisis. So we have faculty, for instance, who are learning to go online at the same time trying to teach online while they live in one-bedroom apartments with a spouse and 2 kids. And so they can't see what it looks like going forward. So they're going to have a lot of anxiety in terms of not just making this quick pivot, but also envisioning how they're going to do this for the next few months. And then we've just got other people who have ill family members or who are feeling like they need to get home to wherever home is. So there really is a much stronger human element to this crisis, I think, than you're going to find in a lot of institutions.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point, because I recall back from my Navy times, we were trained, especially flying airplanes. You're trained. You've got to stay on task. You've got to understand what's going on. You have to compartmentalize all of those other things. And that's very typical for a crisis manager. You compartmentalize, you deal with the emotional stuff after the fact. Not everyone is wired that way. They're not given that kind of training. And you've got to be able to reach out and balance all of those kind of things. The task of doing that is very challenging for many people.
Yeah. So this is one of the things that I found our cabinet bumping into, is we've got both styles, and they're just as critical right now. One of the questions I've been struggling with is where are the best places for that? So one of the gifts of my position at Palo Alto is the president and I complement each other in that. She's much more relational, I'm much more command and control. And so what gets delegated to me, and what does she need to do in terms of moving things forward? So people like me get very impatient when others sit around and talk about, how is this affecting you, and how do people feel, and those kinds of things, because I'm wanting to say, what do we need to do next? What's the next, kind of anticipating where the fires are, anticipating where this is going, thinking a couple of steps ahead so that we're not finding ourselves ill-prepared. That's what goes on in my mind. But for some other people, what happens is bringing people along, making sure that you're not trying to bring people along who are not prepared to come along. And so it's been really interesting and illuminating for me to think about where the appropriate placement of that is. Who are the people in the institution who need to be reaching out to hold town halls, or just to listen to people talk, or to collect feedback, so that we know kind of the language that we need to use, and those kinds of things. One of the things I also, actually, now that I'm talking about it, became very attuned to early on was the language that was being used around this crisis. And I think it was important that we started paying attention to how the language was being used, because one of the things I noticed is if people are anxious, sometimes that comes through in their language, and the communications that were going out to the institution often had language in them that could cause more anxiety or give the wrong message. So, for instance, one of the examples I continue to use is initially when we said, campus is open, people are welcome to come, but we're asking that as much as possible people work from home. It had originally been written that people work from home or from other off-site locations, which was not the message. That there was an implicit message that campus was not safe or we didn't want them there. So we had to go back with an eye to the messages that might be sending messages that we did not intend. And so I think there's a balance between leadership styles and also the messaging that goes out from the various places.
You're absolutely right. And it's so critical that those messages be positive, be very proactive, and be directive to say, this is what's going on, etc. It's like one person told me just recently, we had Scott Cowan, who was the president emeritus. He was the president when Tulane got submerged with Hurricane Katrina. And he was saying that the communications, you cannot communicate enough. It's obviously got to be in the right way. But the other thing too is, and this was something that I learned, is where are your students hanging out on social media?
Yeah.
They're going to be very anxious about what's going on. Is their term lost? Are they going to be able to get back to school?
Right.
And so be tuning into social media sites where your students, your faculty, everybody hang out and find out what they're saying so that you can address those areas proactively.
Right. And one of the things I became acutely aware of in this situation is if faculty are anxious and upset, that also comes through in their communication to students. So I saw it as an ethical responsibility. And that was actually the term I started using, is we are ethically obligated to make sure that the language that comes through the institution is not unintentionally agitating people. So I agree, you cannot communicate too much. Actually, I don't agree. Actually, I don't necessarily agree with that. If you send out too many messages, people stop reading them. So you need to send out timely, important messages so that they know when a message comes, it's worth reading. So I think you do have to be strategic in terms of the messaging. You have to make sure that the messaging comes in the appropriate order so that if it's an institutional decision, that comes before the division communication about how to deal with that. For instance, when we were sending out the message that we were going to take the entire term online, that needed to have come from the institution before it came from the provost's office, right? Otherwise, It looks like we're not in control. It's very important, I think, for faculty and students to believe that there are people who are in control and who are guiding them in a way that's going to keep them as intact as possible. So there are going to be things that we can't do for students, and there are going to be things we can't do for faculty, but we can prioritize what's important. So for instance, one of the things that we were hearing from students was they were afraid they were going to lose their work study or they were going to lose their jobs on campus. So I sent out a list of who all the students were who were getting financial aid, work study or campus jobs, and I asked each of the supervisors to verify that those jobs could be done remotely. And if they couldn't, we were committed to finding other jobs for the students that could be done online. So I think that the communication that goes out has to be substantial and it has to be meaningful and it has to be very clear and very clean so that people understand that decisions are being made with their best interests at heart.
Yeah. And that best interest at heart is critical because when you get into a situation like this, you have to have trust built up already.
Right.
You have to trust your administrators, your president, your provost, all of the people who are driving the bus at this point. And if you don't have that trust coming in, you're not going to capture it in the middle of the crises.
So that's really important. I think that's essential and speaks to the importance of strong leadership at all times in an institution because it's a matter of time before any institution has a crisis. One like this is unprecedented where we're all in crises, but there's something else that happens in the middle of this is people's anxiety and fear gets the best of them and you start seeing people attack each other. And you also need strong leadership at this moment to be able to say to your people in your group, stop, we're not doing that right now. I mean, you have to be able to very gently call people out and say, I understand you're anxious. I understand you don't believe that so-and-so is doing their job. I understand we're doing the best we can. So right now I'm spending a lot of time at getting people to work productively together because during times of crisis like this, people's anxiety and fear and frustration can often get the best of them. So it's important that we monitor that in ourselves, but that we also shut it down very quickly, which is a little harder to do remotely. So one of the things I've done is twice a week, I have my immediate office staff meet in a Zoom format where we just put stuff on the table, and where I just say, this is what we need to do. I know normally this is not something that you might do, or there may be a little less coordination here, but we really need to be able to work with our teams right now to move things forward so that we don't feel alienated or kind of hunker down in our own frustrations or feeling like we're doing things other people should be able to figure out on their own.
And that's critical. You've got to be there to help each other. And crises can bring out the absolute best and can bring out the worst in people as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
And going back to that human element, again, one of the things that I've seen very effective is starting the meeting, a business meeting or something like that, with a brief check-in. Everybody's got 30 seconds to do that, a minute to do that, and then you move on to it. So people can be fully present in the room. As if they're not fully present, they're not going to be able to deal with the issues that are at hand. And these are serious issues.
Right. So we do that. One of the things you have to be really careful of in a crisis, though, is sometimes that 30 seconds, people just don't understand. They're not self-monitoring well. They're not self-aware. And so you need a leader who can also gently pull that in without making the person feel like they're being shut down. And I've noticed also that people sometimes conflate the check-in with business that needs to get done. So it's important that we're able to help each other kind of what I've started saying, stay in our lanes, if you will, in terms of what is the task at hand at this minute. And once we get that off the table, then we can move to the other task at hand. So if the task at hand right now is talking about your emotional state, then I don't want to talk about how so-and-so isn't making time to have a meeting with you so you can get something done. That's not what we're talking about right now, right? We'll get to that in a minute. So I think agendas also are really important now because we all have a lot of noise in our head.
Yeah. And it's dealing with that noise that is so critical. It's like I mentioned earlier, not everyone can compartmentalize as well as others can. And so you have to help them. And that's where if you've got the trust with your team, then they will take and you get agreement right up front. Just says, if you're going on too long, are you okay if I interrupt you? And I don't know if anybody will say, no, you can't interrupt me. But you've gotten their permission to do that.
But and one of the things I'm also finding is, my team and I are working together remarkably well. I just really, despite a lot of the frustrations, and we have one person who started literally a couple of weeks ago, another person who's been on the staff for 4 months. So, there's also a steep learning curve, and then a time of crisis where everything's disrupted. I don't know that you can give too much positive feedback. Constantly saying, you're safe to check in with me. You're doing a good job. So just last night, I got a text from one of my people that said, she asked me, are we okay? Things got a little testy in one of the meetings today. And not only did I write back and say, of course we're okay, but this is what I think happened. I think this person's frustrated and was taking out their frustration that had nothing to do with you. And it sounds like you were wondering if it was because of you. So just understand that we're all frustrated right now. And then I talked to the other person and just said, we have to be a little more sensitive to how people are interpreting our behaviors right now.
And that's so critical because people are sensitive. And when people are sensitive, they tend to take things much more personally than they're actually meant.
Right. And so they need to feel safe, I think, with their leadership to be able to come to them and say, is everything okay? Because if it's not, you need to tell me what I need to be doing right now. So I feel very, very fortunate that, in the few months that I've worked with this one person and in a couple of weeks with another person on our team that, she felt safe enough to say that. And I just said, absolutely, but this is what we need to be focusing on right now. Because not only is it the crisis, we still have things that have to move forward. We have to build next year's schedule. The tenure and promotion letters are coming in this week. Some of these things can be put off. Some of them cannot.
And the more you can give structure to people in times of crisis. I was working with one client and they were talking about, okay, what are we going to do here? Because they didn't have an online setup at all. It's like, okay, put everything on Zoom, have your faculty record their lectures so that students can watch them at any given time, put them up on a YouTube channel, however you do it, and then use your class time as a discussion period. You're given the faculty structure, you're given the students structure. So it's not so crazy that it's like, oh my gosh, when are we going to go to class next? It's like, no, you still got your class times. Let's keep going as you can. And then record everything. Accreditors are being incredibly flexible.
They have to be.
With these kind of things. They have to be. And so it's also an opportunity for you to try out new modalities of learning.
So one of the things we did very quickly, too, when we put together the protocol, we realized that there was going to have to be a lot of training for faculty, because while we had some classes online and we had one program online, the majority of our faculty had no idea how to teach online. So we have a woman who about a year ago was tasked with creating this Center of Excellence in Education. It's CEE. I don't remember exactly what it's called. And she immediately pulled together all these resources. And so we were saying to the faculty, here's the protocol, this is what you need to do. And, oh, by the way, here's mandatory training. So that was another thing that we did that was, in hindsight, kind of brilliant. Before anybody had to go online, just in anticipation that we might have to. So on Tuesday, I think I asked for the protocol to be built. Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, maybe it was Monday, I asked for the protocol. We called for mandatory training for all faculty in the event that we needed to go online. That was Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, or I'm sorry, maybe Thursday, Friday. Saturday, we made the decision. Monday was the last mandatory training, was the day that they all had to go online. So we really were very fortunate in some of the decisions we made, just in anticipation of where this might end up. But that piece of saying to the faculty, you cannot do a 3-hour Zoom, for instance. So what does it mean to meet course learning outcomes in a format that is not going to kill all of you, for instance, or make you look at each other on Zoom for 3 hours? So we were able to really pull these people together to start giving ideas of what it looks like to both meet the learning objectives, but also do it in a way that was more efficient and humane, really, if you will, given 1 or 2 days to get up to speed.
Yeah. And so these are all great things to folks to be doing and thinking about if they're not moved along as far as you are. Yeah. You know, there's another piece in here that you've mentioned that most institutions don't do is risk planning. Now, you haven't called it that, but you've called it contingency planning, what if type scenarios. Talk to that a little bit, if you would.
So, we didn't really have any planning. I think part of it was really happenstance, if you will. So, if you're familiar with Palo Alto University, you know that we had a big crisis a couple of years ago, about 1.5 years ago, where we had a lot of national attention and we had media in our parking lots, and there were some really difficult things that we had to struggle through. And at that point, we thought maybe we would have to take classes online. We didn't have to, but it was in the back of our heads. Several months later, we had huge fires in the Bay Area, and they were asking people to stay off the road. So our librarian and director of academic technologies and I, at that point, had talked about what would happen if we had to take some of the classes online. So, I come from a perspective, and you just heard me say this a few minutes ago, it's a matter of time before there's a crisis at an institution. I don't know if it's going to be a fire or, high winds. When I was at Cal State San Bernardino, whatever it is, there's going to come a time where you're going to have to close an institution for a day or a week or whatever. And so when this started coming down, I called Scott Hines, who's our director of academic technology, and I said, Scott, what did we learn from the last two? What can we pull together? The man is brilliant and thinks very much the way I do. That's why I think he's brilliant. and I always say that about people who I think are brilliant. It's probably because they think the way I do. I understand my bias there.
Yeah, and I love the humility.
Yeah. Anyway, he said, I made a list the last time. And so it took him a day to pull the protocol together. Right. And that's why I think he's brilliant, because it was in the back of my mind, but it would have taken me longer to say, OK, what were the things we were thinking about back then? So he had it. So it was kind of inadvertent risk planning based on the kind of personalities we were, which allowed, once we had that was really the substantial piece. What does the protocol look like? What does the budget look like? How many resources? How much more technological bandwidth do we need? And so now we're dealing with things like who needs a Wi-Fi extender at home? And what do we do with students who don't have access to Wi-Fi? And what about people who can't teach from their home? I mean, those are also really important questions. but they become more easily focused on when you're not worried about how do we get enough Zoom licenses, for instance, right? Or those kinds of things. So in large part, that came from the two previous crises at Palo Alto. And then, my experience and his experience other places in terms of just really understanding that it's a matter of time before there's a fire or a pandemic, if you will.
Yeah. This is a black swan event. People did not expect this, but because y'all had done things previously with two other different crises, you had the structure quasi in place, at least in your mind, to be able to say, this is how we need to execute. So you were not starting from ground zero. I know, bad choice of words.
Well, yeah. But this was a second black swan for us. I mean, the what we dealt with in the fall of 2018, it was cleanly a black swan for any institution. So there were some of us on campus who were ready to mobilize around how we were already thinking. And the gift was it's the same cabinet. So even though the sense is very different because this is way more personalized, we also had pulled together in time of crisis before, which was very helpful.
That's great. So just kind of wrapping up, Risa, 3 things that you would tell a university president about leadership styles and how to weather a crisis like this.
I think that's a really good question. And there are so many more things than 3 things. But I think one of the most important things I've learned during this crisis is that there is a very important place for both a command and control kind of military style of leadership and a relational style of leadership in a crisis. And I think it's important up front now, I understand this, to identify who is good at those things and who should take lead on those kinds of things up front. I don't know that that's anything I ever learned in any of my training or the ACE fellowship that I went through or any crisis I've ever been in the last 3 decades. But something like this it became real apparent that there are people who need to be able to be heard, or, there's an emotional component that we often don't think about of the people we're leading forward. Mm-hmm. I think clarity of roles is really important. One of the things I continue to say to my staff and to the cabinet is, we need to stay in our lanes, but understand where we need to hand things across. So, for instance, academic technology is my area. It's cleanly in academic affairs, but technology is not. Technology is part of facilities. So how do we work together to ensure that everything is being taken care of? And then I think the third thing is to have a lot of grace with each other. Times like this are crazy. There are so many of us there's jokes and memes in the culture, but there are so many of us who aren't even getting out of our regular day clothes during the day. We're not getting up and getting dressed for work. We're getting up, checking our mail, and hitting the day. One of the things I keep hearing is about all these people who are at home now who have all this time. And I'm going to tell you that university leaders are working harder than ever. And we have to have grace with our faculty. We have to have grace with each other and understand that this is a hard time for all of us.
Yes. And you have to take time for yourself.
Yes.
Even if it's 5 minutes here, 5 minutes there, but you've got to recharge your batteries and take time for yourself.
And this is just as important. When somebody says to you, I need to take time for myself, you have to honor that.
Yes.
It's very easy to tell another person, well, you can do that later. But if it's the anxiety of not taking care of themselves, so in this case, getting the food or checking on their family members or whatever it is that they need to do to shelter in place is not taken care of, that anxiety and frustration is going to get in their way of being productive too. So it's important that we keep ourselves healthy, but that we also give the grace and space to people to be able to do what they need to do, knowing that they're doing the best job that they can.
That's a great way to term it, the grace and the space. And so what's next for you?
In terms of beyond
whatever.
I think this afternoon I get to decide if I'm going to call for us to stay online in the summer. I don't know. I'm trying not to pay attention to the news, but I keep getting updates from my staff. The governor just said this is going to last at least 12 weeks. not to be an alarmist, she said. I said, it's only alarmist if you come to me with a problem without a solution. So what I need you to do at this point is look and see what we've offered the last 2 summers. And if there's something essential we need to offer this summer so that our students can graduate on time.
Yes.
We just need to keep our eye on what the priority is. And the priority is the student. It has to be. And then the next priority has to be the faculty to be able to serve the students. Yes. And that's really what we're going to be focusing on.
Absolutely. Well, Risa, thanks so much for taking time out. I know how busy you are, and it's great to catch up with you.
It's wonderful to have the opportunity. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for listening this week, and a special thank you to this week's special guest, Dr. Risa Dickson, Interim Provost at Palo Alto University, and for sharing with us her thoughts on crisis leadership and how to take care of your people in the current coronavirus crisis we are in. I also want to give a special shout out to our sponsor, Blackbaud. Visit blackbaud.com/highered to learn about their cloud fundraising, accounting, education management, scholarship, and analytics solutions that are powering some of higher ed's top institutions. Our next guest is Dr. Bridget Burns, CEO of the University Innovation Alliance, a consortium of higher ed institutions who are leading the way in reinventing higher ed to expand access, address costs, and promote completion for students of all backgrounds. The UIA is doing some great work, and Bridget will share with us some of the ideas that you can implement at your own institutions.
This episode of Changing Higher Ed was brought to you by Blackbaud, the world's leading cloud software company powering social good. Be sure to visit blackbaud.com/highered to learn how they can help your institution deliver a better experience from admissions to advancement. Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show. We would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drum McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.